Prison riots, the most violent uprisings in U.S. history. Fog rolled across the yard of Attica Correctional Facility, drifting like cold breath from the stone walls. It was September 1971, and the prison felt strangely still. Officers described the air as tight, as if the building itself sensed what was coming. For months, small signs had been building, complaints about overcrowding, concerns over sanitation, frustration over communication gaps between staff and inmates. But on this particular morning, something felt different. A correctional lieutenant stepping into cell block D noticed something unusual, a crowd forming around the metal tables even before morning count. In Attica, routines were rigid. Timing was everything. Any small break in the pattern sent ripples through the entire building. The lieutenant felt those ripples as he walked forward, a current of tension moving across the tier. Then came the noise. It wasn't an explosion or a sudden chaos. It was a surge, voices rising, feet moving, people shouting for attention. Officers responded immediately, securing doors and calling for backup, but within minutes the situation escalated beyond what any one tier could control. Communication lines jammed with conflicting reports. Rumors spread faster than instructions. And inside the old stone block, the environment shifted from tense to volatile. The uprising lasted 4 days, a national crisis televised and watched across the country. But what investigators discovered afterward was even more important than the event itself. The Attica incident wasn't random. It was the result of long-standing structural problems that had quietly built over years. Issues involving policies, living conditions, safety protocols, and communication failures all played a role in what became one of the most studied prison uprisings in modern history. When the situation finally ended, state officials launched a full-scale review of detention practices across the country. Committees examined how information flowed inside prisons, how grievances were handled, and how administrative vulnerabilities could escalate into dangerous misunderstandings. New oversight standards were introduced. Training programs improved. Policies were rewritten. But the deeper truth was this: the issues revealed at Attica weren't isolated. Across the United States, correctional administrators began noticing similar stress points in other facilities, places where overcrowding, outdated infrastructure, or stretched staffing created pressure that could build silently for years. By the late 1970s, federal agencies monitored several prisons showing signs of disruption. And then, in 1980, attention shifted to another facility, this time in New Mexico. Investigators studying archived records from that period later described the environment as a system under strain. Like Attica, the New Mexico State Penitentiary struggled with overcrowding and administrative challenges. Unlike Attica, however, the warnings were less visible. Notes found in old reports referenced facility maintenance concerns, inconsistent communication structures, and increased tensions between certain housing units. What would happen next became another watershed moment in U.S. corrections history. But before investigators ever reached the New Mexico case, they needed to understand something unfolding years later, something that proved these issues were not confined to the 1970s or 1980s. In 2018, at Lee Correctional Institution in South Carolina, another major disturbance erupted. It was one of the largest modern incidents in the country, shocking the public and prompting a national conversation about prison staffing levels, housing unit design, and contraband concerns. Forensic teams, administrators, and state authorities conducted months of reviews to understand how communication failures and infrastructure limitations contributed to the escalation. Each incident, Attica, New Mexico, followed a different pattern. Different states. Different policies. Different decades. But behind each one, the investigations found the same core truth. When communication falters, pressure inside a correctional facility can rise faster than anyone expects. Back in Attica, decades after the original uprising, investigators re-examined the old case materials. Among those documents was a small, overlooked note written by a former officer. It described a conversation overheard weeks before the 1971 incident. Nothing dramatic, just a passing comment about uncertainty and rising tension. That note resurfaced during modern training sessions for correctional staff nationwide, used as an example of how early signals can appear small but carry immense weight. And that's where Chapter 1 ends, with another discovery that shifts the investigation's direction. While reviewing historical records from the Attica archive, an investigator in the present day noticed something startling: a set of annotations in the margins of an old report. The handwriting didn't match any officer from the 1971 staff list. It didn't match any administrator. And it didn't match any reviewer from later decades. The ink analysis suggested it had been written years after the original event, by someone who quietly revisited the files without leaving a signature. Whoever added those notes had identified a pattern, a connection between Attica, New Mexico, and later disturbances, long before modern analysts ever saw it. The annotations ended with a chilling line: if the pattern repeats, the cause won't be the event. It will be everything that came before it. The team investigating the documents froze, because whoever wrote that line had seen something coming, something still relevant today. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the overhead lights. A stack of old archives sat on the table, yellowed pages fanned out like a timeline of warning signs stretching across half a century. The investigator who found the mysterious annotations, maroon ink written years after the Attica incident, kept running their finger across the margin, tracing each handwritten line. The question wasn't just who had written the notes. It was how they knew so much. Most archives stayed untouched for decades. But someone had gone back, studied them, and quietly stitched together patterns long before modern analysts saw the connections. Whoever they were, they understood that prison uprisings didn't simply explode. They accumulated. They simmered in places where communication failed, where infrastructure buckled under pressure, where policies lagged behind population growth. The investigator flipped to another page. There was again the same handwriting, underlined dates, circled shifts, a small note that read, "Watch for the quiet days. That's where tension hides." The words felt eerie, not ominous, just observant, thoughtful, precise. And they matched details from New Mexico State Penitentiary, 1980, almost exactly. The investigative team shifted focus. They began cross-examining every major incident across decades, comparing how warnings surfaced and how they were handled. In each case, the early signs were subtle: slight changes in routine, shifts in inmate communication, complaints that seemed administrative on the surface but pointed to deeper issues brewing underneath. The New Mexico files. Records from the 1980 New Mexico incident were stark in their detail, but investigators focused not on the uprising itself, but the months before it. They found maintenance reports describing strained facilities, overcrowded housing units, outdated equipment, and staffing gaps that stretched officers thin. Internal memos mentioned difficulty keeping certain areas monitored during busy shifts. A pattern of transfers disrupted long-standing relationships among inmates and staff. None of these issues were unusual individually, but together, they formed a timeline, an environment under pressure. And now, something unexpected emerged. In the margins of one New Mexico report, dated years after the incident, someone had made annotations in the same handwriting found in the Attica files. This is where the strain becomes visible. The note read, "Not in the conflict, in the cracks that appear before it." The investigator studying the archive slowly leaned back in his chair. Whoever wrote these annotations had worked through decades of files, connecting events that most viewed as isolated. And they left a trail, small, careful, thoughtful, inside the nation's most significant corrections archives. But the biggest revelation arrived when the team moved forward in time. Lee Correctional Institution, 2018. The incident at Lee Correctional Institution became one of the most heavily reviewed modern cases in U.S. prison history. Investigators, state and federal, looked deeply into structural weaknesses, staffing shortages, cell block design concerns, and communication issues between housing units. It wasn't just a prison under strain. It was a system trying to operate with limited tools in a modern world. When analysts compared the administrative records from Lee to New Mexico and Attica, they noticed something remarkable. The patterns weren't identical, but the warning signs were. And then, the discovery. In the back of a 2018 operations binder, inserted between two unrelated documents, investigators found a photocopied page of old Attica notes, complete with marginal annotations in the same unfamiliar handwriting. It was the missing piece. Whoever had been studying these uprisings wasn't doing it casually. They were doing it intentionally, tracking decades of institutional stress patterns from one facility to the next. And they left clues in files that should not have been connected. The team called an emergency meeting. On one wall, they pinned three large boards: Attica 1971, New Mexico 1980, Lee 2018. On each board, they pinned the marginal notes they had found. Same style, same color, same observations. It wasn't evidence of wrongdoing. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a secret message. It was documentation. A long-term study of how small cracks inside correctional systems could echo across decades. Whoever wrote these, the lead investigator said, understood these institutions better than anyone. They saw the patterns before anyone wanted to acknowledge them. But the next discovery shifted everything. The fourth file. A clerk sorting older archives brought out a box labeled Unclassified Administrative Reviews. Inside was a thin folder with no date, no signature, and no clear owner. Inside the folder, 2 pages of typed notes describing a review of multiple prison incidents across different states. But what caught everyone's attention was the final handwritten line at the bottom of the second page. Same maroon ink. Same handwriting. But this time, the note was different. The next warning won't look like the last. Look for what's missing, not what appears. The team fell silent. No facility was mentioned. No state. No year. Just a cryptic observation from someone who had studied these cases longer than anyone realized. It didn't suggest danger. It suggested a misalignment, a missing piece in the bigger picture, something investigators had overlooked because they were focused on what had happened, instead of what should have but didn't. It was a clue. A subtle, quiet clue. And when one analyst compared that note to the logs from Lee Correctional Institution, she suddenly froze. There's an entire set of reports missing, she said. Not sealed. Not classified. Missing. And they were reports from the months leading up to the 2018 incident, precisely the period the marginal note hinted would contain the key to everything. The investigation wasn't just about history anymore. It had become a search for what wasn't there. The room felt colder when the analyst said the words, missing reports. Not sealed. Not misfiled. Gone. Everyone in the archive room exchanged uneasy looks. Paperwork didn't just disappear, not from an institution that documented everything from staff rotations to maintenance requests. The logs from the critical months before the 2018 Lee Correctional Institution incident should have been stored, scanned, and archived just like the rest. But 3 months of internal reports, housing checks, staffing notes, maintenance logs, and communication summaries were nowhere in the system. The lead investigator rubbed his forehead, staring at the empty space on the shelf where those files should have been. This isn't an accident, he said quietly. But it's not sabotage either. Someone removed these intentionally, and not to hide wrongdoing, but to make a point. The team returned to the table where the annotated documents from Attica, New Mexico, and Lee were laid out. The maroon handwriting across decades formed a pattern no one could ignore anymore. Someone had been studying the evolution of institutional strain for a very long time. The missing reports might have been a continuation of that pattern. The search begins. The investigators combed through digital logs, cross-checked storage records, and interviewed administrative staff who had rotated through the office in 2018. One clerk remembered handling the folder years earlier. It was thin, she said. Just a handful of pages. I assumed it was a draft waiting for review. Another staff member recalled something more specific. There was a note on top of the pile. Handwritten. Looked old. I didn't think it belonged there. The team shared a look. The maroon handwriting again. But what happened next unraveled a mystery deeper than the missing reports themselves. The fourth clue. The team went back to the anonymous folder, the one with the handwritten line, look for what's missing, not what appears. They examined the document under forensic lights. Embedded in the fibers of one page, barely visible, was the faint outline of an old watermark, the kind used by administrative offices before the digital transition. The document wasn't from 2018. It was older, maybe much older. Someone had inserted it into modern files to force the investigation to pay attention to a pattern that existed across eras. The team scanned the page again. One analyst suddenly froze. "There's an impression here," she said, "like someone wrote on top of it and left a pressure trace." They enhanced the indentation and revealed 3 faint numbers: 1971, 1980, 2018. But underneath those years, a 4th year appeared, one the team hadn't studied yet. 2005. "What happened in 2005? Someone whispered. The answer came slowly as they searched national records. A series of smaller disturbances across multiple prisons, none major enough to dominate headlines, but all involving similar structural concerns: overcrowding, miscommunication, and undocumented shifts. The year 2005 was a quiet echo of the bigger events. The unknown annotator had connected them long ago. The revelation. As the investigators reviewed everything again, the missing files, the maroon ink, the timeline, the warnings, they realized something profound. The annotations were never about one uprising. They were about the environment that allowed uprisings to happen at all. The unknown writer wasn't pointing to a threat. They were pointing to a cycle, a repeating pattern of warning signs across decades. Not violence. Not intent. Not conspiracy. Structure. Silence. Repetition. The missing 2018 reports weren't removed to hide something dangerous. They were removed to highlight the absence of documentation during moments where attention mattered most. Small oversights. Unanswered concerns. Administrative gaps. Those were the real warning signs. A note in the Attica file said it best. "Watch for the quiet days. That's where tension hides." The unknown annotator had recognized that long before anyone else. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.